It's about time. Tonight, 40 Days of Spring, 1970. Here are Linda Ellerby and Ray Gandolf.
For the next hour, think of your television set as a time machine.
Bring along your scrapbook and 17 years worth of memories.
Welcome to our world. It's spring of 1970, and this is a program about two revolutions. The one that seemed about to happen, and the one that did happen. Revolutions usually come from poverty. This one seemed to be coming from a generation that was mostly well-fed and now seemed to be turning violent.
We didn't like each other very much in the spring of 1970. We didn't like the radicals who declared a private war against the United States. They frightened us. But our government's response frightened us too. It included spying and slander, and at Kent State, homicide. The Beatles had a song that spring called Let It Be. The Carpenters had one called Close to You. The songs may have expressed what we yearned for. They did not express what we were.
Why do birds suddenly appear every time you are near? Just like me. They long to be close to you. Why do stars fall down from the sky every time you walk by?
Many of you find the war repugnant, and as a result are inclined to listen to those who advocate violence in the name of peace.
The spring of 1970 is an angry time. People, especially young people, fill the streets, protesting this, advocating that, confident that their rambunctiousness and inventiveness can make their dreams come true. The establishment holds its ground.
Lots of flags.
Section 1 of the General Laws of the Commonwealth.
The Riot Act is popular reading.
Refused or neglect to disperse shall be considered participants in an unlawful assembly and will be subject to arrest forthwith.
Most of the young anger is directed at the war. Nearly 500,000 young Americans are fighting that war.
I've seen fire and I've seen rain. I've seen
The soldiers are tired of the war, and tired of the anti-war protests which some feel comfort the enemy.
could not find a friend. But I always thought that I'd see you again.
More than 40,000 Americans have died in Vietnam. One of the busiest anti-war groups is the Moratorium, which wants to shut down normal life for one day a month to protest the war. Young Sam Brown was one of the coordinators.
I mean, if you looked around the moratorium office, you know, it was 40 people jammed into 6 or 8 rooms, sitting on top of each other, bags of mail with money in them coming in from contributors around the country, things pasted all over the wall, people working 20 hours a day, mimeograph machines running like mad. It's craziness. It's absolute nuttiness. But if you're 18 or 19 or 20, there's a much greater sense of urgency, particularly if you're faced with the draft.
Curiously, the moratorium folds in April of 1970, believing that people don't want to take to the streets anymore. But the streets are busy. Sometimes people are protesting the protesters. President Nixon has asked the silent majority to speak out, and they do. They have a symbol, the hard hat, and they have a theme song.
We don't smoke marijuana in Muskogee. We don't take our trips on LSD. burn our draft cards down on Main Street. We like living right, being free.
In New York City on May 10th, hard hats attack anti-war protesters. Ten days later, thousands rally in support of Richard Nixon.
God bless America.
One of them was Tom Patchell.
You want to know how I felt about the parade? I felt damn good. I felt patriotic. I felt that I did my thing. I felt that some poor bastard laying in a ditch in Vietnam is going to feel good now. I have a sign and it says, "We burn pipe, never American flags." On the side of my hard hat, this is peace with honor. And this was a basic feeling, you know, of the fellows at that time. Peace with honor. Get it finished and get out of there.
But the government's policy of gradual withdrawal, which they support, had taken a disconcerting turn.
Tonight, American and South Vietnamese units will attack the headquarters for the entire communist military operation in South Vietnam.
Nixon is bringing some American soldiers home, but his invasion of Cambodia to get at communist sanctuaries is seen as dramatically expanding the war.
The invasion of Cambodia is too much. The campuses here at home explode in protest. Ohio, Kent State University. Some students burn the ROTC building. The National Guard is called in to restore order. But most of the students are peaceful, and the presence of the National Guard outrages them. They get even madder when President Nixon calls student protesters bums.
You know, you see these bums, you know, blowing up the campuses. Listen, the boys that are on the college campuses today are the luckiest people in the world.
Joe Lewis is a freshman at Kent State University.
I was not a bum. I was an 18-year-old American, fully aware of how lucky I was to be going to a university in America where your freedoms are guaranteed.
Lawrence Schaefer is not a student. He is a 26-year-old sergeant in the Ohio National Guard.
We were in there to enforce the law and order. We weren't really trained for that. We were trained for combat.
Noon, Monday, May 4th. Students hold a rally, many of them unaware the rally has been forbidden. The guardsmen are ordered to break up the rally. The background sounds you hear are the actual sounds recorded that day. Another student, Barry Levine, is there with his girlfriend, Allison Krause. They hear the order to disperse.
And the students reacted with more chants and a refusal to disperse. And then the guards started to move forward.
The guardsmen chase students away from the university common. The method, tear gas. Among the last students to get away, Barry Levine and Allison Krause. Now the troops are on a practice football field. There is a fence on 3 sides. Guardsmen feel boxed in. From the adjacent parking lot, students jeer and taunt the guardsmen. Some, a few, throw rocks.
I remember how, you know, it was a light-colored brick. It was and just a half one, and it smacked. I heard a crack, and I thought, sure, my arm was broke. And that's when we decided, you know, that enough's enough.
And so Sergeant Schaefer and a few other guardsmen kneel and point their weapons at the students.
I could not conceive that why they were pointing rifles. These are clearly military weapons. These are unarmed students.
Perhaps the point is made. After 15 minutes, the National Guard retreats. 2,000 students are watching.
I thought that that it was over. At that point, there were cheers, in a sense. I think the students, certainly myself and Allison, felt that there was a small victory there.
They were cheering. They had won. They were sending us back. At that point, we got over the crest of the hill, and there was a single shot.
Joe Lewis is standing 60 feet away.
3 of them, I remember, turned in unison, all turned the same direction, and pointed their guns at me.
Guy on my right fired a shot. Well, it was impossible to hear what was going on. Maybe the order would get been given, fire warning shots. The guy on my right fired, so I figured, well, if he's firing, they must have given the order. I fired in the air.
The first sound of it, I thought, well, they're firing their blanks. Immediately, I noticed at my feet there were puffs of dirt and cement from the sidewalk I was standing on, flying up into the air. I realized then that these guns had live ammunition.
Although a photograph seems to show Joe Louis standing still, Sergeant Schaefer believes Louis is coming at him.
I felt, not knowing, you know, that if this person was going to inflict harm on us or myself, I had to use what abilities I had to stop this person.
I was standing still, giving him the finger. I was 18 and arrogant and foolish.
I fired at him. I assumed that I hit this person because he did drop.
I was shot. I don't remember saying, oh my God, they shot me, but someone near me at the time said that that's what they heard me say.
In 13 seconds, 67 shots are fired, all of them by the National Guard.
As we ran, we ducked behind a car. Actually, I ducked behind the car, and Allison fell behind the car because by then she had been hit in the back with a bullet. And I didn't realize that for several seconds. She was on her back, and she was more or less calling to me that she had been hit. And for a few seconds that doesn't register because she didn't believe that there was live ammunition in those guns, but it was clear that she was shot and badly, and she was losing consciousness, and I was helpless, holding her in my arms, watching her bleed to death.
On the way to the hospital, Allison Krause dies. She is 19. 3 other students, Jeffrey Miller, Sandra Scheuer, and William Schroeder, are also dead. 9 students are wounded.
Teach your children well, 'cause their father's hell did slowly go by, and feed them on your dreams. The one they picks, the one you'll know by. Don't you ever ask them why, 'cause if they told you, you would cry. So just look at them and sigh, and know they love you.
Come back to the spring of 1970. It wasn't all that bad.
Mamo, you magnificent bastard, I read your book!
Welcome back to Our World. In April of 1970, an international team of geologists concludes beyond the shadow of a doubt that the South Pole was once located up here in the Sahara Desert, and presumably in another 500 million years it could be back there again. Technical and social change are moving a whole lot faster. In the spring of 1970, we could ride in the huge new 747, an astonishing airplane that could carry more than 400 passengers, about twice as many as any other jet on the market. And some of those passengers could remember when the Wright brothers first got aviation off the ground. Alvin Toffler, writing about future shock, looked at the frazzled, manic pace of life and predicted that it would only become faster and more frazzled, accelerating all the time, and that as a result, we would become susceptible to a whole catalog of physical and psychological traumas. For some of us, in the spring of 1970, it seemed that future shock was already with us.
Evolution
Revolution, got control the sound, so shooting rockets to the moon, kids growing up too soon. Politicians say more taxes will solve everything. And the band played on.
Consider music. All of a sudden, in the spring of 1970, here are the Temptations singing about revolution instead of romance.
Hey, a little girl, comb your hair, fix your makeup.
So why should that be less confusing than Glenn Campbell singing about little girls when females are demanding rights as women? Especially when neither is quite as shocking as Janis Joplin singing anything at all. Joplin with her bottle of Southern Comfort, her own brand of acid rock, and her outrage.
What it needs, what it wants, what it needs, what it wants.
America's Junior Miss for 1970.
Pretty as a picture.
Now this seems to be what parents want from their children. However, this seems to be what they're getting.
You can't always get what you want.
At first, it might seem that Future Shock is just another way to say generation gap. But if that is the case, why then is Madison Avenue trying to sell skirts to men? Women are supposed to wear longer skirts, but after mini skirts, confuse.
It looked like just a long tree trunk or something walking down the street.
Oh, I dig them. They're groovy.
Hollywood tried to keep up, to keep the customer satisfied, but does the customer want the glorified war of patent?
Elmo, you magnificent bastard, I read your book!
Yes, sir. I guess I better call me.
Or the inglorious war of MASH, a painfully funny treatise on war's insanity.
Suicide is painless. It brings on many changes.
MASH wins the top award at the Cannes Film Festival, but it is barred from being shown at U.S. military installations, military morality.
The game of life.
And what about the new morality? What is Hollywood to make of this? Is it enough to have Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice smoke marijuana? Maybe not.
Our ears are beginning to get warm.
Orgy! Have an orgy! Orgy! Orgy!
Maybe they should all hop into bed together, too. And what is Hollywood to make of the new technology? Like computers. Computers keep getting bigger and bigger, and they seem to be in control of everything. Some people worry that computers will take over the world, and that is the subject of the movie, The Forbin Project.
The choice is yours. Obey me and live, or disobey and die.
We are pretty impressed with computers in the spring of 1970, although most people have never seen one. They cost millions, do mysterious things, and they are attended by a kind of technical priesthood. But it isn't these computers that will take over the world. It's this one, and it will take over the world by getting smaller. Ted Hoff is the guy who dreamed up the microprocessor. In the spring of 1970, when they began the design of the chip, none of his team thinks of themselves as revolutionaries.
Essentially, we did take the computer out of its ivory tower, out of its walled-in, glassed-in, air-conditioned cage, and we put it, you might say, everywhere.
Nothing's gonna change my world.
The microchip did change our world, and more than any rally held here in Central Park, or any revolutionary song sung by the Beatles. The Beatles, in fact, were not revolutionaries, they were rebels. And as such, finally, they were unable to agree even with themselves. In the spring of 1970, the Beatles broke up. The music stopped. And a generation that claimed to believe in radical change was suddenly faced with its own kind of future shock. The very music that had seemed to score an entire
Come back to the spring of 1970, when a pound of Long Island potatoes cost 9 cents, and when all that millions of Americans wanted was to breathe clean air and drink a good glass of water.
Our World will continue in a moment with 40 Days of Spring, 1970. Our World will be right back.
Welcome back to the spring of 1970, a season of revolutionary ideas. The same March issue of Playboy that gave us Alvin Toffler's shocking look at the future gave us a feature article on revolution and counter-revolution. And on the cover, the publisher's girlfriend. Nothing revolutionary about that. But revolutionary symbols were all around us that spring. Counter-revolutionary symbols, too. Maybe clothes didn't make the man or woman, but they sure let you know where they stood.
Still, clothes weren't ideas, and it was ideas that challenged the establishment. Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas wrote a book, Points of Rebellion, in which he said that young people were absolutely right to rise up against poverty, injustice, poor education, and pollution. He said dissent was an American right, and Douglas pointed out that violence was not protected by the Constitution, but that protest often boiled over into violence because people were emotional, not rational. He was right. In the spring of 1970, the pot boiled over.
We got to get together sooner or later, because the revolution's here.
3 members of the Weatherman Underground are killed when a bomb they were building explodes in a New York City townhouse. In April, the survivors polish up their rhetoric and declare war on the United States.
This is Bernadine Dorn. I'm going to read a declaration of a state of war. This is the first communication from the Weatherman Underground. Protests and marches don't do it. Revolutionary violence is the only way.
We have got to get it together now.
For a couple of freelancers in Madison, Wisconsin, the war has begun. Carl Armstrong and his brother have bombed an ordnance plant from a plane. Carl has bombed an ROTC building. And in the spring, he tries to blow up a dam.
We, made a lot of mistakes. We were scared stiff all the time. I mean, we were really paranoid. And it was the firebombing of the ROTC building on campus was the first illegal thing I had done in my whole life. I was scared. Everyone was scared, and, it wasn't an easy thing to do.
Led by the FBI, city and state police strike back all across the country. They see the damage done by a few real revolutionaries and conclude that the American way of life is in jeopardy. And they jeopardize it further by launching the broadest program of domestic spying and infiltration that this country has ever seen. John Ehrlichman was the president's advisor on domestic policy.
It's hard to say whether what the FBI did, for instance, was an overreaction. When you were there and these reports were coming in, people being killed, injured, laboratories being blown up, that kind of thing, I think everybody felt that there was an obligation to do something. Now, the methods that were used to try and find out who did it were eventually held to be illegal, unconstitutional. We didn't know that at the time.
Those methods are aimed at women's groups, gays, American Indians, almost any organization that advocates social change, and there are lots of them.
Because the American protesters are holding out the last hope.
Another voice advocating change in Chicago belongs to young Jesse Jackson. His cause is Operation Breadbasket. On his first day at the police academy, Howard Pointer is recruited to spy on Jackson.
They informed me that they wanted me to work for the Intelligence Division Subversive Unit, which was known as the Red Squad. In the spring of 1970, I was sent to Operation Breadbasket, and I was told to become vocal and so that I could move up within the organization and therefore gain or gather more information for the police department.
Well, then believe it, my friend, that the silence can end. We'll just have to get guns and be men.
The most feared group is the Black Panthers. On the one hand, the Panthers are a political and social organization. They provide breakfast for inner-city school children. Yes, but they also carry guns and vow to use them in self-defense. By the spring of 1970, 4 policemen and 28 Panthers have been killed. Bobby Seale, chairman and co-founder of the Black Panther Party.
All we did was picked up guns and says, we're going to organize our people, and we're going to exercise our democratic right to do so. But if you shoot at us, we're shooting back.
Their meetings were probably the most frightening of all of the meetings that I attended, because they would say, we know you pigs out there, you know, in the audience, and we know that you come here to spy on us, and we're going to kill you, you know. So everyone in the audience would look at each other, you know, they would, you know, become paranoid, start looking all around, who is it, you know, is it you? And I would sit there and look kind of mean, you know, it's not me, I'm not doing it, you know, it must be this guy behind me, you know.
Free Bobby Seale! Free Bobby Seale!
Spies were not tolerated. Bobby Seale was on trial for killing an alleged police informant. But still, many people thought Seale had been framed. There were Free Bobby rallies. If he were convicted, said the Panthers, they were prepared to start a war, a civil war.
The Black Panther Party throughout this nation had armed themselves while I was on trial and said if they convicted me, it was the word was out that there would be no lights for days.
Childhood, we are told, decides. And so it is that Sesame Street tries to show black and white children living in harmony. It is meant to be a song for the future, a better future. But in May 1970, the state of Mississippi refuses to broadcast Sesame Street. It has too many black people on it.
Well, Sesame Street survived, and so did the kids, uncorrupted even in Mississippi, where the program was soon restored. Kids are not incorruptible, certainly, but when they encounter corruption, they're more likely to resist than succumb. When they see the corruption of the earth, the pollution of their environment, they're more likely to wonder why than make excuses for it. And in April of 1970, when adults proclaimed Earth Day and declared war against pollution, kids didn't wait to get drafted, they enlisted. 10 million school children made some kind of public statement that day. From Thomas Jefferson's memorial across industrial America, from sea to no longer shining sea, it's time to stand up and be counted. Dennis Hayes was the organizer of Earth Day.
There were literally hundreds of projects that were embarked upon around the country that were anything from trying to save prairie grasses in the Midwest that were being covered over with housing developments and other developments and were disappearing forever, to a lot of focus upon parklands and upon marshes and wetlands around the country.
Earth Day is a smash. It's reported that on April 22nd, 30 million Americans demonstrate for a clean environment. There is no violence, there are no injuries, there are virtually no arrests, but there is anger.
You are lucky that you are breathing probably the last of the oxygen.
New York City bans cars on Fifth Avenue for 2 hours and tens of thousands march. On this day, pollution has no friends.
There was a sense of exhilaration that was just incredible. One of the reporters came up and said, "Do you realize this is the largest demonstration that has ever happened any place in the world in the course of human history?" And we all felt, I suppose in some sense, a sense of achievement, but more than that, a sense of exhilaration that we had really touched something that was capable of moving America.
Saving the Earth seemed a fine notion, if a chancy one. That same month, saving the Earthmen seemed even chancier. Lost in space is a real possibility. Come back to the spring of 1970 for the appalling Apollo adventure.
Our world will continue with 40 Days of Spring, 1970.
In the technological revolution that is taking place in the spring of 1970, there are two questions to ask. Will man control machine, or will machine control man? For 4 days in April, the answer to both questions is yes.
The space program has settled into predictable success in the spring of 70. 2 sets of astronauts have strolled on the moon, and another is ready to go. There is no inkling that the mission might fail.
3, 2, 1, 0. We have commit, and we have liftoff at 2:13.
It was our third manned mission to the moon, Apollo 13, and no one paid any particular attention to the flight's unlucky number at first. In that spring of 1970, this was the most advanced, most complicated machine man had ever built. It came in 3 parts, or modules. The command module, named Odyssey, the home for the astronauts. Its job is to get the astronauts to the moon and back. The service module. It houses the powerful rocket to change course, and it carries the supplies and power for the round trip. The lunar module, or LIM, named Aquarius. Its job is to take the astronauts to the moon's surface. That's all. No problem, so far.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Yes. Houston, we've had a problem.
Here is a bulletin from ABC News. The Apollo 13 spacecraft has had a serious power supply malfunction that could cause the lunar landing mission to be terminated early.
One of the service module's 2 oxygen tanks has exploded. The side of the service module blows off. Jim Lovell is the commander.
There was doubt in our minds exactly what caused the noise.
Fred Hayes is the lunar module pilot.
All I really thought was this is not normal, and it may be something very bad.
And it looks to me, looking out the hatch, that we are venting something. We are venting something out into space.
We're losing oxygen from our second and last bottle.
Are you satisfied that both of these tanks are going down and we're past helping them, even with batteries?
The explosion has destroyed the power supply to the command module, and it starts to die, slowly. The lunar module has some supplies and its own battery power, but is not designed ever to return to Earth.
The only way to get home was to use the lunar module as a lifeboat.
The astronauts are now 200,000 miles from Earth. They can't turn around, so they have to keep going towards the moon, hoping to use its gravitational pull as a slingshot to shoot them back to Earth. The command module has to be abandoned. The crew moves into the lunar module turned lifeboat, where, without computers or guidance systems, they are totally dependent on mission control back on Earth. Earthbound controllers have to figure out how to stretch what's left of the oxygen and battery power to keep the astronauts alive. And the lunar module rocket has to save the day. It has to.
This maneuver has to work. If it doesn't work, there's almost no place else to go. And as most of you are aware, there is no rescue possible in spaceflight.
The change in course is successful. Apollo 13 will swing around the moon. But the lunar module, Aquarius, which was meant to be left on the moon, has only enough water, oxygen, and battery power for 2 days. The trip home will take 4 days. Houston tells the astronauts to speed up and conserve. On Tuesday, April 14th, 1 day after the explosion, when Apollo 13 is behind the moon, 250,000 miles from home, the astronauts fire the rockets again. It will burn 3/4 of the lunar module's remaining fuel.
My attitude was one that we would do everything possible right up to the very last bit. If we bought the farm after that, well, we would go out knowing that we had done everything that we could do.
Ground control can do no more for now. An anxious world waits and prays.
Would you like to say the Our Father for the astronauts right now? Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come.
The astronauts are speeding toward Earth, but lonelier than ever. Communication is a sometimes thing. The radio produces more static than information. On the ground, astronaut Joe Kerwin is on the other end.
What I remember mostly during the long hours of return is sitting hunched over at the console with my headset on and the volume turned all the way up. And the voice contact with the crew would be an occasional thing, low in volume, through a whole lot of hash and static.
I'm afraid I didn't copy that, Fred.
The next day, Wednesday, still 200,000 miles from home, the astronauts have turned off everything except the radio and a fan. The entire spacecraft is operating on about 400 watts of power. It's dark and it's cold. And the spacecraft is drifting. It might miss Earth entirely unless the course is corrected by hand. The astronauts have to do that twice. Thursday, April 16th. Still 150,000 miles to go. Houston prepares the astronauts for their return to the command module. But the plan is chancy. The batteries in the command module may have frozen. And even if they work, the circuits in the capsule could crack while they're warming up. Friday, April 17th. The carrier Iwo Jima arrives at the point in the Pacific where Apollo is aiming for splashdown. 2.5 hours before re-entry, Jack Swigert turns on the power in the command module and the batteries work.
The Earth kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and you knew that you had limited time to accomplish all those tasks, to get everything done, because as we approached the Earth, we were going to hit that atmosphere, and you had one chance.
Fred Hayes is ill, temperature well over 100, but he keeps working. The crew cuts loose the service module and for the first time sees the damage wrought by the explosion.
And there's one whole side of that spacecraft missing. Is that right? Really a mess.
Next, the astronauts jettison Aquarius, the faithful lunar module. It will burn up in the Earth's atmosphere.
Farewell, Aquarius, and we thank you.
It's not over yet. The command module might still miss the re-entry corridor.
If we had, somehow missed the Earth, drifted on by, it was my intention that we would remain alive as long as possible, even though that the hope for survival was lost, and that maybe towards the very end, all we had to do was to depressurize the spacecraft by opening up a vent, and we could have done ourselves in that manner.
If the angle of re-entry is too steep, the astronauts will burn up in the Earth's atmosphere like Aquarius. If the angle is too shallow, they will skip off the atmosphere toward an eternity in space. They hit the atmosphere at 25,000 miles an hour. Even at the proper angle of re-entry, the astronauts will burn up if the capsule's heat shield has cracked. The intense heat blocks communication. As the recovery helicopters take their stations, Mission Control has heard nothing from Apollo, nothing but static.
Capcom, why don't you try and give him a call?
Odyssey Houston, standing by, over. Okay, we read you, Jack.
Then, finally...
Visual contact, flight. Odyssey Houston, we show you on the mains. It really looks great. Oh, yeah, your shooting looks good.
Capcom, I think the recovery force has got him.
See how they shine. Oh, if it be I'm sailing right.
Apollo 13 splashes down within 800 yards of its target. For 4 days, 3 extraordinary men have gone up against the universe and come out without a scratch. Technically, their mission is a failure. Some failure.
There seems to be a curious lesson to be learned from the Apollo 13 mission. In 1969, man walked on the moon, and a sense of triumph drew us together. A year later, a moon mission nearly falls apart, and what do you know? A sense of near disaster seems capable of drawing us together, too. Come back to the spring of 1970 for whatever other lessons there might be. The #1 best-selling book in the spring of 1970 was Love Story, a book which began with these words: "What can you say about a 25-year-old girl who died? That she was beautiful, that she loved Mozart and Bach and the Beatles." In a way, the spring of 1970 was like that girl who died. If so, here's her legacy.
In 1974, nearly 4 years after Kent State, 8 National Guardsmen were indicted on charges of violating the civil rights of the 13 dead and wounded students. At the trial, all defendants were summarily acquitted by the judge. In 1975, the wounded students and other survivors sued the governor of Ohio and National Guardsmen for damages. 4 years later, they got a settlement of $675,000 and a statement of regret.
By 1975, the student protests of 1970 were over. But by 1985, students seem once more to have found their voice. Whether in protest to the racism of South Africa or the American intervention in Central America, the beat goes on.
The Black Panthers disbanded. All charges against Bobby Seale were dropped. He writes cookbooks now. But Panther militancy made it easier for mainstream black politicians to be accepted.
I'm okay. I'm Julian Bond, running for Congress. I appreciate the rents.
And to be elected mayor in Atlanta and in Los Angeles. And to run for president with a rallying cry that may be premature, but is not impossible.
Our time has come.
The new morality was replaced by the old morality when the children of Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice reached puberty about the same time herpes and AIDS reached epidemic proportions. And the casual attitude about marijuana was replaced by a general alarm about cocaine, crack, and the consequences of drug abuse.
Earth Day focused our attention on poison. More than 200 million tons of it spewed into the air in 1970. But in December of that year, Congress enacted new, tougher air quality standards, and the Interior Department banned the use of DDT on its land. And last October, President Reagan, reluctantly, signed a bill for $9 billion to clean up toxic waste dumped.
After Apollo 13, we did go back to the moon, and on December 14th, 1972, men left the moon for the last time.
3, 2, 1, ignition. Right away, Houston.
The name of the last lunar landing module was Challenger. The Apollo program was replaced by the Shuttle program.
Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
On January 28, 1986, the name Challenger came to mean something very different from triumph or survival.
Go and throttle up. Roger, go and throttle up.
On that day, we were reminded, in a final way, that it is bureaucracies that really build spaceships.
Computers are us now, guiding everything from video games in the home to cruise missiles in the sky. They can bring pleasure or death in microseconds. They make no moral judgments.
This is a uniform. See the word?
Computers can teach little children their native tongue and can teach older children the language of computers. But they cannot teach moral judgments either.
The Beatles have never been replaced.
Well, there it is, the way it was for about 40 days in the spring of 1970. 2 revolutions that sowed their seeds that spring were accomplished without casualties, without firing a shot. The microchip revolution has brought computer technology into the lives of every American every day. We may not understand computers, we may not like them, we cannot escape them. Earth Day drove home the message that we were drowning in our own filth, and we heeded that message. But the bombs thrown by radical young revolutionaries, the shots fired at harmless students at Kent State, and by American soldiers fighting a war they hadn't started and would not win. Those shots didn't seem to accomplish very much. Maybe real revolutions don't need guns.
In the spring of 1970, in April, CBS News conducted a poll to see if people still supported the Bill of Rights. Questions were framed in terms of contemporary events. Here's one. As long as there appears to be no clear danger of violence, do you think any group, no matter how extreme, should be allowed to organize protests against the government? 76% said no. In fact, the majority of Americans polled refused to support 5 of the 10 protections of the Bill of Rights, which is why we need a Bill of Rights. It protects the minority from the majority, who, by definition, need no protection. I'm sure that had they been asked the question, do you support the Bill of Rights, those people would have said yes. Trouble was, without the bill, people didn't recognize the rights. And so it goes. Also in the spring of 1970, President Nixon rejected a meeting with 9 black congressmen who wanted to discuss problems concerning black America.
On April 24th, China launched its first space satellite.
On April 26th, the bill was introduced to make the daisy a national flower.
Labor leader Walter Reuther and entertainer Gypsy Rose Lee died.
27 states reduced first-time possession of marijuana from a felony to a misdemeanor.
In Iowa, iceberg lettuce cost 9 cents a head.
Armed Forces Day ceremonies were canceled or revised at military bases because of a fear of anti-war protests.
F-111 fighter planes cost $16 million apiece.
The Knicks won the National Basketball Association championship against the LA Lakers.
On April 16th in Eagle Pass, Texas, Linda Ellerby's son Joshua was born. For a transcript of this